Okay, everybody, we're going to start things off. So, good morning and welcome to the ISEEESA International Case Challenge. My name is Lauren Rooney. I'm the president of ISEEESA and I'll be the MC for today. So it's fantastic to see such a diverse group of students with various educational backgrounds participating in the challenge. As I saw from reading a lot of your pre-event reports, you all have each brought forth different perspectives on the topic, and I'm very eager to see your presentations this afternoon to the judges. A few little housekeeping things. Volunteers have volunteer on their name tag, so if you have any questions, just go to them. Can the volunteers in the room raise their hand just to kind of on the outside? So if you do have any questions, just go to ask those people. There'll also be someone who will have a video camera throughout the day and will be asking students, judges, sponsors, volunteers, and speakers questions about the case challenge and their experience. And that will be Kuhn. I don't think he's in the room right now. So I would like to thank all our sponsors who've made this event possible. So that's Suncor Energy, Cenovus Energy, Shell Canada, Accenture, the Energy Resource Conservation Board, and the Haskayne School of Business. So I would now like to introduce Stephen Kaufman, who is Director of Climate Change Management and Solutions for Suncor Energy, who will introduce our first speaker.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Lauren, and for the opportunity to just say a few words before I introduce your first speaker. I wanted to highlight why the topic of global energy dynamics is so important to Suncor. Most of you are probably aware, but if you're not, Suncor Energy is Canada's largest petroleum company. We're active in Western Canada in the oil sands and natural gas. We've got production in the East Coast offshore Newfoundland, as well as in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa. We have 7.5 billion barrels of reserves and 19 billion barrels of contingent resources, which allows us to have a growth plan that we believe is going to take us from the current production level of about 500,000 barrels a day to over 1 million barrels a day by 2020. Global development of the oil sands, of course, is very important, and Suncor has been a leader in that, a pioneer initially in the 1960s and leading that now. And it's that resource, of course, that has placed Canada third on the list of international countries for petroleum resources behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Global energy dynamics is a very current issue, and despite the fact that it has had a history of several centuries, from back when whale oil was used as a lamp fuel, through mined coal and shipping transportation, and later on with crude oil and electricity, bringing energy across continents and between countries to supply the people of the world with energy. With a population of 7 billion and growing to an expectation of 9 billion by 2050, the world's population also expects to have reduced poverty and hunger that's going to come from economic growth. And to drive that economic growth, we do need energy for fuel. I'm just going to list a few of the current issues around global energy that I'm sure you're familiar with that affect Suncor and Canada. You know, there's declining conventional oil supplies, a need for more difficult resources like the oil sands, the deep offshore petroleum resources, and shale sources of fuels. There's the challenges of climate change and impact of potential carbon regulations, both nationally and internationally. There's domestic and regional security of supply issues here in North America, as well as in the EU and developing countries. As you know, there's a lot of strong resistance from people to what I like to describe as anything in my backyard. And those kind of developments can include, of course, crude oil pipelines, as we've seen in the news a lot recently, as well as wind farm developments, fuel crop plantations, which people would argue are taking away from food cropping, nuclear power, and other sources of energy. And there's the continued high cost of alternatives to the conventional fossil fuels of coal and oil and gas. And then finally, there's the fact that the energy industry is a global industry. There's global dollar flows of investment, and there's global trade based on energy. And of course, as we've seen in the last 3 years, the contagions that happen in one area of the world are not limited to that area anymore with the way the financial institutions are interlinked. So we can have global economic challenges that flow back to every country, and truly making the idea that no country is an economic island very, very much a part of this century. So for these reasons, Suncor believes global energy dynamics is a very interesting and challenging topic for IC to have taken on in today's sessions. We really support your group's effort and believe that smart, young, proactive leaders like yourselves are going to be the foundation to solving these challenges as you move out into the workforce. So good luck with that moving forward. I'm very pleased also to introduce a colleague I've known for over 10 years, Dr. Bob Page. Dr. Page is currently the TransAlta Professor of Environment, Management, and Sustainability at ISEEESA at the U of C. He's a past chair of the National Roundtable on the Economy and Environment in Ottawa, where he advised directly to the Prime Minister's office, and he just ended that term last year. He's the current chair of the Management Committee of the International Standards Association for Environmental Standards, which is based in Geneva, and he's a member of the Board of Directors of ENMAX here in Calgary. Bob's past record is really quite amazing and substantial. He worked as an academic for 20 or 25 years in environmental science and as a dean at the school here at the U of Calgary. Spent 10 years at TransAlta from 1997 to 2007 as the Vice President of Sustainable Development, and was instrumental in that company, which is Canada's largest private sector utility, instrumental in the operations they did related to sustainability, trading of carbon credits and the like in the US, Australia, and elsewhere in the world. He's also a member of the Business Environmental Council Leadership, which is part of the Pew Center on Climate Change, and has been an expert witness in a number of US Senate and Public Works committees on climate change, coal, and emissions trading. So I'd like to welcome Bob. I'm sure he has a lot of insight to provide your group and help stimulate discussion for the rest of the day.
Well, first of all, it's a very great pleasure to be here this morning to interact with you, to throw out a few ideas to begin with. I'm a great admirer of this organization from my past experience, and I think it's tremendously important that you're trying to give an international context to what we're trying to talk about today. I spend quite a bit of time on the road myself. I'm accused of being a major supporter of the international airline business, and I apologize for that. But I do spend, I'm just back from, in January, from 10 days of meetings in Madrid for the ISO 14000 series globally. And we're on, our next set of meetings are in Bangkok, in Thailand, and we have about 108 countries formally involved in this process, and several dozen more informally in connection with it. So I really like the topic that you're going after here, and I really think here in Alberta we need to be looking at this more carefully, even just to understand marketing for our companies. I also wanted to say, in starting off, a special word of thanks to our Indian colleagues who are part of this process. India playing a very important role, as it did at Durban in the recent international negotiations. In my own experience, I have been involved with a CDM project in Gujarat, and I have also been involved through the intergovernmental panel with some of the Indian colleagues over the years in connection with science issues. And so it's a tremendously exciting time for me this morning just to have this opportunity to talk. First of all, in terms of looking at our topic for today, it's so important, I think, to try to bring some clarity out of this myriad of factors and influences and programs that we have to face here. Some economic, some social, some political, some environmental in connection with it. And it's for that reason of trying to bring some clarity into it that both in our ISEE graduate programs and in our outreach from ISEEESA as an organization, we like to focus in on what we call systems. And my talk this morning is going to try to look at that. How, by understanding different systems that are at work, we may make some sense of our world. We may bring some coherence to those myriad of factors that we have to deal with in connection with it. And this is not just an issue in connection with our individual understanding of the issues. This is part of the urgency that we face today in an international sense in connection with it. And so, coming back to this, I like to just give one example of what I mean by systems here. In the province of Ontario, in Canada, 10 or 12 years ago, in response to the Kyoto Protocol and other things, they just announced they were going to close the coal-fired power plants in Ontario without bothering to look at what the alternative power supply was going to be to fill that gap, to fill that vacuum. And so a lot of the confusion and difficulties we've seen in Ontario in the period since has been a product of that lack of a systems approach, looking at just what we were closing for emissions reasons, not looking at what the whole system needed in terms of doing it. Also, in starting this morning, I really believe as an individual we're into a period of profound social and other change right now globally. And I often like to compare it to the period of the American and the French Revolution, when fundamental shifts were underway in a global sense, where we saw the U.S. Declaration of Independence in 1776, and what that meant in terms of the development of democracy worldwide. The same year, in 1776, Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations, and the sort of concept of international free enterprise economic development, which flowed from it. And background, in the same year, you're seeing the beginnings of the new coal technology, which drives an industrial revolution. Each of these are significant in their own way, but together, in a systems way, they changed fundamentally the whole world as we saw it at that time. And today we're seeing that same kind of systems fundamental change, which is so important for us in trying to both understand and to influence what's going on around us. We see the way in which the Western democracies, especially the European Union and the United States, are now seeing their power erode to China, to India, to Brazil, and to a whole second tier of nations below those three in terms of where we're going. We are seeing in different parts of the world, and I recently spent time in Africa in connection with some of the emerging issues we're seeing there. And we see new forms of capitalism and private enterprise and state-private combinations in connection with it. We also see, as you all are so aware, the sort of globalization of communications. Globalization on one side of structures and communications, creating a way in which, and I spent 2 years ago quite a bit of time in Cairo and on the streets of Cairo when they were hosting some of our, and the way in which the electronic revolution was destroying the capability of states to control the information flow to their citizens, and what that means in terms of the Arab Autumn and various other things that we're seeing. And lastly, in terms of the systems approach today, the intimate way in which energy and the environment is changing so many of the guidelines and the rules in which we open. Now, in all of this, there is no silver bullet. There is no quick fix. with all due respects to Suncor and oil sands there, it's part of the program, but there's no simple way we're going to go through it. And I often like to think of a story when Louis Armstrong, the great jazz artist, he finished a concert and a very young reporter shoved a microphone in his face and said, "Mr. Armstrong, where will jazz be 25 years from now?" And Louis sort of looked back at him and said, "If I knew, don't you think I'd be there?" And I think that's the challenge that all of us face today in terms of trying to navigate through where we're going and making a sense of that world around us. In terms of coming back to what I want to talk about today, in terms of systems, I really see there are about 6 of them. And I just want to touch on each quietly and briefly, quite inadequately actually. First of all, as background to everything we're doing today, we're seeing the most fundamental challenging of our financial structures since the Great Depression. And why do I say that? I say that because it includes sovereign debt, the debt of nations, the ability of nations. And when I was in Madrid this month, I was seeing at first hand the way in which the Spanish government was trying to cope with their debt problems. We see in North America with the crisis on Wall Street of the last 3 years, the way in which private sector capital structures are under stress and in some cases incapable of fully meeting the needs. And lastly, and as the International Monetary Fund pointed out 2 weeks ago about Canadians, their level of personal debt is now at an unprecedented level in connection with this. So in terms of systems then, our financial system at the state, at the corporate, and at the personal level is in a period of stress right now, which is background to some of what we're trying to do. Secondly, and I was struck as I was watching the news last night in connection with the reopening of the Canadian House of Commons yesterday, and the way in which then government today and government systems today are trying to cope with the large debt that's involved, and the way in which, to a certain extent, what we're seeing and we have seen before is the downloading of responsibility from federal to provincial to municipal in terms of the levels of government. And that has a whole variety of environmental and energy context in connection with it. Thirdly here, and I'm sure all of you are very aware of many of this, are the energy systems, which Stephen made reference to in his opening comments a few minutes ago in connection with it. And one of the greatest challenges we face today as we're going forward in terms of environmentally appropriate technology is financing, is finding the necessary capital assets to finance things like carbon capture and storage or other things which we're after from an environmental point of view in connection with it. Or one can look at the way in which with the new fracking techniques and horizontal drilling, we're into that explosion of natural gas reserves, which is having repercussions in a system sense through to oil, to coal, to renewables, and in other directions in connection with it. And from Canada's point of view, the growing potential of self-sufficiency, both in gas and oil, with the United States and implications for us. Or we could go on and we could look, and a number of you have, because I know from some of your conferences and your work, and you'll be into it in greater detail, is the whole way in which then environmental systems begin to come into play. And I often like to emphasize both the time and the structure which is involved with environmental systems. One of the things that really struck me a few weeks ago was that my wife and I were at the movies to see The War Horse, which some of you may have seen in connection with it. And as I was watching that movie, I was thinking, you know, given the century of lifetime for much CO2, some of what took place during the First World War in terms of that CO2 is still with us today. And that legacy context of systems then becomes important as we look forward to the future. And some of the CO2 we're producing today is then going to be with us for close to or as long as a century. Or we look at the way in which, in environmental systems, we are so often in public policy focusing on the producers of energy, whether they're oil sands or shale gas or whatever it happens to be, or coal. And in actual fact, so much of what is really important is driven by the consumers, not by the producers. The consumers are, to a certain extent, reacting to the market in connection with it. And lastly, on environmental systems, and we saw this with such detail, such sad detail in connection with Durban and Cancun, and before that with Copenhagen, the weakness of global institutions to achieve consensus for that development in terms of the... So all of these things and the social systems that underlie them, whether you're in Bangladesh or whether you're in Africa or whether you're in Latin America today, the way in which energy, environmental systems then impact so greatly on... And so many people today, several billion worldwide, do not have access to the fundamental needs with electricity that it provides in terms of poverty eradication. So all of this then comes into play in terms of what we're trying to do with systems. Each of these are distinct in their own right, but each of these in turn are interacting in terms of us trying to define the solutions. And sadly, in many cases, as was the case in Ontario when we just cut the coal-fired power plants, or at least the government did it, announced it at the time, it wasn't really a solution because it wasn't looking at it from a systems point of view. I want to turn next just to look at carbon for a couple of moments in connection with it, because carbon is, without a doubt, the most complicated of the environmental systems and the most complicated of the environmental problems that we're trying to address. And why is this so? It is so because carbon is fundamentally a biological phenomenon. I can remember once being in a conference where the tensions were rising, and one of the industry spokesperson was speaking, and one of the NGOs said, "We want to eliminate all carbon dioxide." And the response was, "Well, I think you should stop breathing." And the biological context of then the way in which carbon and CO2 is a natural product of humans and a food for vegetation, or the way in which fossil fuels are so central as yet to our economy, or the way in which in consumer attitudes worldwide. And all of these then mean that from a systems point of view, the complexity and the interdependency that you get into with carbon makes it that much more difficult for public policy and that much more difficult in terms of international cooperation, collaboration, and connection with it. And in looking at then, we have to try and find a balance between the way in which we have natural uptake of CO2, which has been going on forever, with things like oceans, wetlands, clouds, etc. and the increasing degree of industrial emissions which we're adding to that to distort that balance, to create that imbalance. And how, in a public policy sense, do we counter those industrial emissions which we're now adding to it in a global sense? And all of that sounds simplistic, but as Durban showed, makes it very. And on some of this, the role of clouds and the role of oceans, we're still grappling to fully understand scientifically where it's going. Yet, in looking to the future, we know that climate change will take place for a variety of reasons, of which CO2 is probably the most single one, but not the only one. We've got huge sun storms going on right now, which are interfering with a variety of communications and other issues. And in doing that, we also, in a global sense, and this is something which so often gets ignored, we have to focus in on adaptation, not just on mitigation. And I want to come back to that in terms of the sub-Sahara states before I finish in connection with this. But nonetheless, in looking at this, then, we have to look at it from a systems point of view in which we have mitigation on one side, which is trying to rectify the chemical imbalance in the atmosphere with CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And on the other side, adaptation, which once again I want to come back to in terms of circumpolar area before I finish this morning to try and do it. And all of this makes our analysis both a very complicated one and also a, sorry, I'm now having to scroll down here. I just want to go on and talk just for a couple of moments about one aspect. This is looking at energy, and this is looking at electricity in particular. And here we have nuclear, we have coal, we have gas, carbon capture and storage, we have solar PV, and we have solar thermal, and we have wind. And essentially, as I was trying to suggest to begin with, dealing with one of these alone is not the solution. We have to begin to look at the way in which all of them interact. And part of this, if you look at the first item here, the white block, then the carbon tax. In this scenario, they were putting a carbon tax of $100 a ton CO2 in order to, and that $100 a ton takes coal from being very significantly the least cost source of power generation, then up to a market level, which was, in terms of this estimate at least, equal to or slightly better than nuclear. Gas today, the cheapest source of electric power, and we're seeing conversion worldwide of coal plants to gas for a variety of systems reasons relating to economics, finance, and markets in connection with it. And in these boxes, one of the things that we run into with the black is the basic capital and operating costs of the system. And once again, this becomes a very important factor in the overall. And we look at solar PV, and these numbers, by the way, are about 3 years out of date. And that would have come down some, and solar thermal here, and finally wind. Now, in terms of all of this as well, you can distort this by things like feed-in tariffs, which we're seeing in some Canadian provinces today. So the system is then geared to promote renewables, as is the case in Ontario, with significant new feed-in tariff revenue to the owner of the generation in order to distort the normal market forces to achieve social goals, in this case with. And the last thing I would, because this really comes back to Alberta and comes back to other areas of North America, is that it's all very well to have renewables, but you have to have renewables working into the system. And the system is transmission. And in some cases, areas of Alberta, irrespective of other factors, you do not have the transmission, and new wind would not carry the cost of the new transmission being built into the area. So what we're into here then, in looking at a comparative basis between energy sources, is then a variety of factors of which then we're looking at as a unit or as a single thing in a systems approach. I want to turn now to wind and just look. These are wind variability from Germany. Germany, one of the leaders in the development of wind and renewables, with huge public investment in order to allow it. But you look at this and you think, gee, isn't this marvelous? The low amount of CO2 emissions that are involved in a system relating to wind. And yet you start translating that variability in wind into a system, and you quickly see that Germany had coal or nuclear or other power capacity in a standby basis in order to then allow for that to develop. And once again, from a systems point of view, bringing us back to some of the questions we have here. Now I want to turn next to what I referred to very early, and that was the weakness of international institutions right now to find consensus, to find collaboration, to define a legally binding global agreement. And we have two different approaches here with strong support for each from different quarters of the world and with different strengths and different weaknesses. As we saw at Durban and before that at Cancun, the Kyoto model is one of the two models that we're looking at. Now, what, from a systems point of view, does Kyoto mean? Well, Kyoto is a top-down system. And I can remember, because I was involved in some of the international negotiations on this, how limited were our ability to take the ballpark figures that we talked about at Kyoto in '97 and actually convert them into a meaningful public policy. The Chrétien government of the day agreed to certain things for Canada. The Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Chrétien warned him that they had no means of delivering on the goals that Canada had committed to because there was no systems approach behind it to look at what it really meant in connection with it. So Kyoto, we have a top-down system. We have a targets-based system, that is targets for nations. We have absolute targets, which means it's on the basis of the total emissions for the country as a whole. They are based on the 1990 baseline, and we've had huge changes since 1990 in a variety of directions. And it's a European-style regulatory system with emissions trading, with caps and cap and trade system. And most importantly, from my point of view, a CDM system, the Clean Development Mechanism, which allowed companies in developed countries to then invest in projects, as TransAlta, when I was there, did, as Suncor has done, and then bring back the credits, the CO2 equivalent credits, back to use against. Now, why is that a concept which is viable? It is because CO2 circulates worldwide. And what happens in Russia 3 days ago is over North America, then over Western Europe in terms of the wind patterns that follow through it. So Kyoto is one model we have, a top-down one. The other model that I'm involved with, and we have, as I said earlier, 108 countries, and we have over 225,000 companies worldwide involved in what is called the standards approach. It is a bottom-up process. It is a process which is focusing in on the individual company or project. And as so doing, you define a standard. It can be technical, it can be process, which that project then has to meet. And the targets generally are developed by industry on the basis of best practices. They're on the basis of what can be done, what is doable in a financial and a technical sense at that time. The baseline is now, and the developing world in particular, and this is why the airlines love me, across the developing world in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia today, we see a huge expansion of the standards approach led by China, because it is in their sense doable today, as opposed to a system like Kyoto, which penalizes economic growth, and the developing world wants economic growth to deal with poverty issues in connection with it. The second thing that standards do when they are formally verified is they allow you to avoid carbon discrimination in terms of tariffs or tariff surcharges. And one saw in recent American legislation, one sees in European legislation, European Parliament legislation today, then provisions for a carbon-based surcharge from countries then and products in differing systems. I want to turn now to two very important examples of how systems are evolving and developing today, and how changes are so clearly underway in ways that are quite tragic in a number of ways. I want to turn to Africa, and I have seen some of this myself directly in connection with it. But essentially what we've got with the Sahara Desert here, and the way in which wind patterns change as part of climate change, and the way in which precipitation then becomes so variable. We have seen in this Sahel area of sub-Saharan Africa, a whole band of states today, from Senegal all the way to Eritrea and Somalia, then a whole band of states that are suffering enormously. We think we have had drought problems, then we should extrapolate from southern Alberta into a vision that we might have had in 1928, 29, 30.